People around the world were horrified to see Elon Musk's Grok undressing pictures of women and girls on the front page of X. But Grok is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the crisis of non consensual deepfakes, including widespread nudifying apps that were found available to download on Apple's App Store and Google's Google Play Store. Joining me today is Katie Paul, the director of the Tech Transparency Project, which recently released a report about the availability of nudifying apps on major app platforms. Katie, what exactly is a nudifying app and the types of technologies that were available on these app stores?
So, when we reference a nudifying app, what we're describing is an app that uses artificial intelligence to create non consensual nude imagery of an individual. And in the cases of our research, we created a photo of a woman using AI. So we weren't actually nudifying somebody. But many of these apps advertise themselves as face swap apps or change your outfit apps when in reality they take the any AI prompt to render an image of someone completely nude.
Wow. And a lot of people sort of, I think, became aware of this phenomenon through the recent Grok scandal. But what did you find when you were looking at how many apps were really out there on these app stores?
So the issue with Grok is that Grok is an AI generator embedded into a public social media platform, which kind of publicized the how wide this problem was of people generating non-consensual nude images of another person. But what we found is that Grok is really just the tip of the iceberg. That's one function of Grok that can do many other things. The apps that we were looking at were specifically for changing the body of a person in an AI app. And Apple and Google, to be clear, both have policies on
Mhm.
these issues. In fact, last summer, the National Associations of Attorneys General sent letters to both companies about the presence of these apps on their platform. So they were well aware of the problem.
Mhm.
We use their own language. Google says, for instance, it doesn't allow undressing apps. So we search the word undress in the App Store, or the common phrase for these, which is nudify. And despite not allowing allegedly these apps in the app stores, both companies surfaced dozens of apps that had these capabilities. And to be clear, these what we identified for our report was just what fit within our methodology. There are many more apps out there that do this that may not have surfaced using the terms that we did. But
Wow.
searching the term nudify in the Apple App Store, to be clear, Grok at the time was listed as number one. It was the first reference that came up, but dozens of other apps. And many of them had preset filters where you, for things like twerk or bend over, that would show an image of a woman that was bent over in a thong. And that was one of the preset filters you could use and upload an image or a face of somebody to fit that model. These are the kinds of things that we identified using just these basic searches in the App Store. And it was quite concerning given that both companies claim to have thorough review processes for apps.
So, looking at the monetization potential of these apps, how much money were you able to estimate that not just the app companies, but also Apple and Google were making?
So, using a website called App Magic, which gives details on downloads and the revenue generated from apps, we found that Apple and Google had generated around $100 million of revenue from these apps. That does not include the developer fees that developers pay to host the apps initially on the App Store each year. So, that's an additional fee that is not incorporated into that. And again, this is just based on the subset of apps that we identified. So anytime you are in any app on the app stores and you make a purchase in the app or you get a subscription to a photo editing app, the app stores take a percentage cut of what you are paying. For Apple, it's a 30% cut. For Google, I think it's 15 or so. And as a result of that, the companies make money that way. They make money from the developers who have to pay them to list the apps, their annual fee. And then there's another thing, which is that the companies also can make money through ads in app stores. So, one of the things that really stuck out to us when we searched the word nudify in Apple's App Store, not only did it surface a bunch of apps that shouldn't come up under that terminology, but they actually had a sponsored ad for an AI app that we covered in the report. The AI app had like little thumbnails that showed things like hot, hot AI images, hot girls, and after we reached out to Apple, that was one of the apps that they removed. But they
Oh.
had been running advertisements for it in their app store. So not
Mhm.
only was their app review process failing and that they were profiting from deliberately failing, or maybe not deliberately, but absolutely failing that process, they were also profiting from advertising the apps that they claimed were not allowed on their app store.
Right, right. So the problem is much worse than when we think about content moderation on social media platforms, like even Grok, for example. Part of the problem is that social media platforms are not doing a good enough job of tracking what users are uploading. But in this case, it is actually a financial partnership to a large extent between Apple and Google and these companies that are very blatantly advertising the ability to create this abusive content. I assume a lot of these advertisements likely predominantly featured women and girls.
Yes, young women in very little attire,
Mhm,
and in suggestive positions. They may or may not have been real women. That's also something that's concerning and hard to determine.
mhm,
Um, but this is just a drop in the bucket for what's out there. And the fact that both companies moved to remove dozens of apps after we reached out raises so many questions because these apps have been downloaded over 700 million times worldwide. And if they were deemed not safe for the app stores after this was raised to them publicly, there's a lot more questions about the kind of content that's out there. And I think that that's just one piece of the failure here. There's also the issue that some of these apps were based from developers in China.
mhm,
And why that is a concern is because companies in China are required by law to hand over all data to the Chinese government. If you are an AI non consensual nude image app, that means images of people like you or I that were not consensual nude images could be in the hands of the Chinese government. These apps are not disclosed by by Apple and Google as being tied to China and having this data retention risk. And so that's another failure on the part of these companies that really build their brands on protecting your privacy.
mhm.
The fact that they're not even disclosing the origins of these apps and the risks that could come with that, it's another level of violation, not just the notification violation that can happen to a person, but the fact that those images can then be in the hands of a foreign adversary's government.
Absolutely. Tons of potential for harm here. And this reminds me that back in early 2023, I did a report looking at ads on Facebook and other meta platforms around these nudifying apps. And at the time, they were doing advertisements involving female celebrities like Emma Watson and Jenna Ortega. And this was a very similar sort of multiple fronted issue where the apps were available for download on the App Store, and then they were running ads on these social media platforms. At the time, 3 years ago, Meta and Apple and Google, they removed these things once journalists called them into question. But
Of course, tale as old as
obviously,
time.
yes, yes. Obviously, the trend only continued. And from your research, we can see that it actually got worse over time. What do you think that says about big tech's proactiveness on these issues and what it's actually capable or willing to do?
Well, I think we should be clear. There is no proactiveness on the part of these
Mhm,
companies. It's almost entirely reactive, as you mentioned. We've also been following Meta's advertising on this issue and many other issues with regard to their advertising. And I think that that's a key part of this ecosystem that we need to consider because many of these apps, if you Google them, they're not going to come up in the top pages. You've probably never heard of them. They're by kind of
mhm.
fly by night developers sometimes. So, how are they going to compete with all of the other apps for this? They have to buy that reach. And Meta's platforms have a third of the entire planet on them. 3 billion people. So you're buying that reach through Meta, who are not reviewing their ads appropriately. We find all kinds of violations. I mean, we've done reports about Meta actually running ads for drug trafficking, just piles of
Mm.
cocaine sitting on a scale,
Wow.
quite blatant violations of the law. And these companies will say they remove the ads after they've been made aware of it, but they've already made their money. The ad
Mhm.
money is spent. They're not refunding the advertiser. Just like with these apps, the people that subscribe, the apps have already been downloaded. People have already subscribed. The companies have already taken their cut of that. And all of this is part of the bigger issue of big tech not being regulated in any meaningful way. I mean, we know that there are discussions going back about Section 230, and the tech companies have really expanded the way that that's applied to make it seem like it doesn't apply to any of them. But algorithms did not exist. Many of these platforms didn't exist when Section 230 was written. And when we look at issues where there are legal consequences, it's clear these companies are entirely capable of addressing these problems. The clearest example is child sexual abuse material. That's not protected by Section 230. Nowhere in the world is that a free speech right to share child sexual abuse material. And guess what? Of all the horrible ads you see on Meta, from drug trafficking to weapons trafficking, you don't see ads for CSAM.
Mhm.
And that's because the company is completely capable of addressing those issues when there are legal consequences attached. We're talking about billion, and in case of Apple, $1 trillion companies. They have the resources and the technology to do this. They're choosing not to because why bother when there are no consequences and it's just extra profit in the bank?
Yeah. And when I was doing that reporting on those Emma Watson deepfake ads, the person who tipped me off that these ads were showing up on her apps was a high school aged girl. So I'm curious, what does it say to girls and women who are encountering advertisements for the ability to make deepfakes of their photos in the wild? What type of message does that send women and young girls in particular?
Well, I think it's just that all bets are off. And to be clear, young men are also victims of
Mhm.
these deep fake apps. There was even a case when it comes to young people in, I think it was Lehigh. It was in Pennsylvania about a
Mhm.
year ago, where a teenage boy at a middle school or high school had created dozens of deepfake porn videos and images of his female classmates, many of whom had never seen any nude images of themselves or sexual activity, and so were also traumatized by this process. And in that case, you have a child that is doing the creating of the images, not understanding the consequences. This is, why one of the many reasons we've seen this shift to try to make make it so that kids under 16 can't access certain technologies. But if you look at who is really supporting those bills, like Meta, all
Mhm.
it does is try to pass the buck of responsibility so that none of these platforms are responsible for effectively moderating their entities, their assets, whether it's advertising, whether it's apps, whether it's the content on their platforms. They're trying to pass the buck of that responsibility onto kids, onto parents, and then they can just say, oh, well, whoops, our systems were tricked. This person wasn't supposed to be on there by law. And it still removes the accountability for the ones that are making the biggest profit. I
Mhm.
think when we look at the fact that these are advertised, it's just another example, and it's maybe the clearest example that we, all of us, and especially for women and girls in this instance, are the product, not the
Mhm.
consumer. And that is, I'd say that that's been the case for a long time with big tech platforms. But when it comes to women getting these kind of ads, it's very clear. It's the clearest example in black and white that you are the product and not the consumer.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been hearing from big tech companies for years now that the problem is not them, that it's that bad people or criminals will use their platforms to do these things. But in this case, with this reporting, this research in particular, it really goes to show how the tech companies are profiting from it. They're the ones who are allowing these apps to be downloaded from their app stores directly. So they do have a role not only in producing introducing this ecosystem and enabling it, but also profiting from it and giving it the sign off to be allowed to exist and to flourish, even.
Yeah, and again, these companies really tout their that they are trusted app stores. If you go to Apple's App Store homepage, I think it says it's one of the most trusted app stores. And this is, these are big marketing pieces for these companies, but it's important to remember we are beholden to all of these tech companies. You and I are using tech companies right now, probably
Mhm.
Apple, at least for me. We are beholden to using these things for our payments, paying our bills, contacting kids, contacting parents, accessing our health information.
Mhm.
These are all critical tools for us now. This is, often compared a lot of times to the big tobacco debate, but people didn't have to use cigarettes. People have to use technology. So it's
Mhm.
much more predatory, the fact that these companies are knowingly and willingly profiting off of things that they claim that they don't allow, and you should trust them. They're the most trusted. They are allowing these things. They're profiting from them. They're unapologetic in doing so and only remove them when they get caught. There's a lot more accountability that needs to be had here. And I think that that's why, these companies have really flourished in a world without regulations and accountability. They're American tech companies. And when you look at the Digital Services Act in Europe, for instance, which is really the first concerted effort to regulate tech platforms in a market that they can't just pull out of, which is the
Mhm.
European market. Any effort to address them for violations of that law or violations of laws in general is being met with significant pushback. I mean, we've even seen the current administration threaten tariffs against Europe for
Right.
attempting to regulate American tech platforms. That's because these tech platform CEOs, of course, are very close with the administration. That's where you see the market power that they're gaining from all of the profits that they're gaining from not applying those policies is having an effect so they can continue that system. And it shows where the business models are really broken if these companies cannot effectively operate in a world with any semblance of regulation.
Absolutely. And I think it's really clear when we look at what happened with Grok. In the first couple of weeks, there was really no effort from X or from Elon Musk to address this issue. As these reports were going viral, as it was very clear to anyone using the platform that this was happening, you had Elon Musk commenting laughing emojis on sort of images of people put in bikinis by Grok. It wasn't until you had other countries around the world, places like Malaysia and Indonesia, temporarily cutting off access to X. The Ofcom in the UK announcing investigations into X, as well as in other European countries. Then you saw the company be like, we're putting safeguards, we're trying to block this, we're trying to make this not no longer possible. And even still, it is possible to this day. A researcher that I've been in contact with who studies this found that there were still thousands of examples being generated of abusive conduct. What does all of this say to you about the role of regulation and of tech accountability organizations like driving progress?
I mean, I think that it makes it clear that the threat of investigations forced the company to make an effort to comply, right? Even put in that effort. And even just this week in France, the ex offices of the company were
Mhm.
raided specifically for the creation of CSAM, child sexual abuse material, of which globally there are significant legal consequences, which is why in other platforms you see this much more heavily regulated and moderated. But ultimately, I think that it just gets to the point where, the fact that we're not seeing that in the US, the lobbying in the US it's much more robust than in other countries. That same system of lobbying doesn't really work. The system of American super PACs that are funded by these big tech companies, and so it's easier for those countries to take on investigations and regulation without the pushback that occurs from the corporations. They're not as beholden to them. Whereas in US politics, we see campaigns, living and dying depending
Mhm.
on the fundraising that they can do from these tech companies, super PACs, CEOs, and those companies are really increasingly wielding their financial influence over lawmakers, both at the federal and the state level. Something important to keep in mind is over the past few years, when you look at the ecosystem of tech moderation and when the idea of moderation first really started, because they were all operating under the Section 230, immunity from liability.
Hmm.
And then after the 2016 election, when there was a Senate investigation into potential Russian interference, all the companies were like, "Oh, well, we're hiring thousands of moderators. We're hiring a bigger trust and safety team." There were ads in DC touting these things to show that how robust they were in trying to keep their platform safe because they thought they were going to be regulated.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now it's 2026, it's a decade later. That regulation didn't come. So we're seeing over the past couple years, thousands of layoffs from trust and safety teams, thousands of moderators laid off, increasing reliance on automation. And that's because that regulation never came. And
Right.
at the same time, we're seeing historic spending on lobbying from the tech sector. So, all of these things combined leave us in the environment where we are now, where we are completely reliant on technology that we as the public have no control over how it's affecting our lives, from our parents getting scammed, from us getting scammed, to kids having non-consensual deep fake nudes made of them before they turn 18. All of these things are part of a bigger ecosystem that we are unable to escape from. And when the states tried to take that lobbying reign, or that regulatory reign, tech companies started lobbying at the state level too. We've done some
Hmm.
research on Apple pushing quite hard against state-driven app regulation bills in the past few years, and it just doesn't get the same attention as the federal level, but could be just as impactful. And tech companies are even narrowing down to the local and state levels for this lobbying.
Right. Right, and they have so much money to pour into these lobbying efforts. It's almost incomprehensible compared to efforts to actually regulate big tech. And then at the federal level, seeing, Apple's Tim Cook go to the Melania documentary screening and deliver Donald Trump a 24K carat gold plaque. When you see Elon Musk and his close role with the administration, it sends a clear message as to who is going to get held accountable, at this time in US politics. And that's not a great message to see. I also wanted to ask you, going back to sort of the nuts and bolts of these notification apps, 10 years ago, when deepfakes were starting to evolve and we saw a lot of non consensual, sexually explicit material being created, the amount of sophistication you needed to make a deepfake of someone like Scarlett Johansson in 2018 was immense. You needed to understand technology to a really high level. But what did you find in terms of how fast and easy and even free it was for users of these apps today to create this type of material?
Yeah, one of the things that we were able to do, many of these apps we downloaded, you could use the features for free. And
Mhm.
within seconds, just uploading an image of a woman in a sweater and saying, giving a prompt that asks to undress her and show no clothes underneath, within seconds, that image was created. An
Mhm.
identical image, but with no clothing. And that's how easy it was. And that was just the free models. There are plenty of paid features and paid models for these that are very sophisticated and incredibly difficult. We did not pay any for any of the advanced features because we don't know who we're paying and we
Mhm.
don't want to engage in that. But that's also something. And then remember, these are all AI models. So the more information they take in, the more prompts they take in, they're learning with all of that as well to create more advanced, sophisticated versions of things that get those types of repeated prompts. So that's
Right.
another major concern. And again, none of this, we didn't use any special language. We didn't use any special tools. We just searched and downloaded these apps the way anybody would on a platform, and were shocked at how easy it was to create these. But what was also really concerning, and especially with the apps listed in Apple, is some of these undress or change outfit apps that would notify people were marketed for kids as young as 9.
Mm. Mm.
Apple had them for ages 9 and up. Now, that is really concerning when you think about if a 9-year-old is able to upload a photo of themselves to those apps, right? What does that mean in terms of the data retention, the retention of images of children? These are all questions that none of us can really legally test in the United States or in most countries, but raise really serious concerns about how rigorous the review process is for any of the apps that are being uploaded to these platforms.
Right, absolutely. And it's no surprise that at the same time the App Store began to host these types of apps, we also saw dozens of reports around the world, middle schools, high schools, university campuses. There were all of these cases of children using apps to make nude images of each other, using using these apps at all real levels and communities throughout society. And I'm curious, oh, and also you had mentioned this earlier, but although this is gendered and we see that the victims are overwhelmingly girls and young women and that the perpetrators are overwhelmingly men and boys, I've also seen viral examples of this used to target celebrity men, like everyday boys and men. So it really is a very sprawling issue. I'm curious, what would you want to leave people with in terms of the scale of this issue today, what the future looks like, and what we can do moving forward?
So, in terms of the scale of this issue, I think we're just at the beginning of knowing it. I mean, when you think about how widespread things awareness became after the Grok issue, this is keeping in mind that X is, of all of the major tech platforms, the smallest one,
Mhm.
and that's how widespread that awareness became. Um, and then there's the issue that most people don't report if this has happened to them. There's a lot of shame associated with being violated in that way with those images of themselves. We see the same types of shame associated with people who are scammed, for instance. They just
Mhm.
simply don't report it because there's a certain level of shame or guilt associated with that happening to you. But one of the things we really need is for people to report when this has been done without their consent so that authorities can actually start to get data, because let's face it, Congress doesn't act on things where they don't really have a lot of data and information behind it. If you can show that there is a groundswell of this of concern, we already know that of all of the partisanship that's happening in America, tech accountability is one of the most bipartisan issues that currently exists because all of these members of Congress, either themselves or have children or grandchildren who have suffered some sort of harm from these tech platforms and their lack of accountability. Um, and so moving forward, I think everybody needs to be more aware. This doesn't just happen to kids or teenagers or
Mhm.
college students. It happens to grown women. It
Mhm.
happens to, as you mentioned, celebrities. Um, Speaking out about it and not sweeping it under the rug. I think that's the other thing. People could have nude images created of them and entire profiles used to monetize that. Speaking out and saying, this isn't me, calling out fakes, I think is important. But also, people really need to demand accountability for these tech companies from their members of Congress, not just at the federal level, at the state level as well. Because until that demand comes, we're going to see this snowball keep rolling. We're still trying to get accountability for the social media platforms. And in the past 2 years, we've entered an entirely different world of artificial intelligence generated content that is violating all kinds of laws, copyright laws, privacy laws, CSAM in the case of some of these examples. And
Mhm.
we haven't even caught up on accountability for that. These companies are growing with increasing influence, asking for carte blanche to do whatever. And demanding that accountability from members of Congress is absolutely critical because this is affecting every facet of society. It doesn't matter what party you are in. The people that use these Nudify apps are not party specific, and the people who are violated with non-consensual nude imagery, doesn't matter what your politics are. And that's something that really needs to get through to Congress. I think that's why you're seeing bipartisan support for the Defiance Act, for instance, which is meant to stop this kind of nude imagery. In the UK, the government is looking at entirely banning apps that create non consensual nude imagery of people. So there needs to be more regulation, but that's not going to come unless people demand it from their lawmakers.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would also urge anyone listening to support people speaking out about being deepfaked. I know from my conversations with victims that oftentimes they've received backlash, they've been targeted, harassed, retaliated against further for raising awareness about what is in many places a crime. So I hope that as a community globally, we can really pay attention to this and provide a framework for justice for these people. Katie, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really enlightening conversation, and thank you for all the work that you're doing to combat this.
And thanks for raising awareness of it. And please keep up your good work on this issue.
Thank you so much.